Chapter 29 for you. President Woodrow Wilson, Progressivism Part 2, beginning of World War I. Let's get going. All right, 1912 election. We're going to focus on three main people. The Bull Moose campaign of 1912. The Bull Moose is the political party for Teddy Roosevelt, also known as the Progressive Party. Wilson runs on something called New Freedom, and he proposed the following things: stronger antitrust legislation, meaning going after those trusts; banking reform, which would allow the government to increase the supply of money when needed. We saw this as a problem during the Panic of 1907, and also tariff reductions. Remember, Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. Democrats want to see tariff rates go down. Roosevelt hates Taft because of two things. One, he fired Gifford Pinchot, Taft's buddy. And two, he broke up some trusts that Teddy thought were good trusts. So he runs for the Progressive or the Bull Moose Party. And this moose is telling you to vote Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is supported by Jane Addams and many women. Unfortunately, in 1912, women couldn't vote. He had a platform, Teddy Roosevelt still had a platform, named New Nationalism. And he believed a powerful government should regulate the economy and help guarantee social justice. This would cause an increase in the power of the federal government. Two Republicans. Remember, Roosevelt was a Republican, so what this does is it pretty much guarantees a victory for Wilson. So look at this political cartoon. We have the elephant, which is the Republican Party, that's Taft, divided by Bull Moose or Roosevelt equals a victory for the donkey or the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Two Republicans going against each other will split the vote, guaranteeing a win for Wilson. Let's compare Roosevelt's New Nationalism and Wilson's New Freedom. Both favored a more active government in economic and social affairs. Very important to know, you will see these two quite often, that the two are similar and they call for more involvement by the government. Roosevelt also campaigned for women's suffrage, minimum wage, and social insurance. And Wilson's New Freedom favored small enterprise, free functioning, and unregulated and unmonopolized markets, so going after those trusts. Now, Wilson is considered a minority president because he wins just over 6 million popular votes, and Taft and TR, remember, those Republicans, they gained 7.5 million combined. Another major minority president was Abe Lincoln in the election of 1860. We have Eugene V. Debs. Again, he is a person, not a court case, Eugene versus Debs. Please don't confuse them. He runs on the socialist ticket, here he is, and he gets nearly 1 million votes. And socialism is a growing force, and we'll see it continue up until 1920 and including. Taft later becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921, and again, he's from Cincinnati. And that's a very large robe he's wearing. That's mean, I'm sorry. Okay, we need to keep in mind that Wilson is a Democrat, so he wants to lower the tariffs. He goes after what he calls the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banks, and trusts. So let's focus on those in a couple minutes. Bully pulpit. We were introduced to this term under Teddy Roosevelt. What bully pulpit is, the president appeals to the public to gain support for legislation and policy, encouraging the public to contact their legislatures to get them to support a certain policy or a law. This again was popularized by Teddy Roosevelt, and it was used by Woody Wilson as well. And he tried to gain support for a lower tariff, and Wilson went before Congress and helped get it passed. This tariff was the Underwood tariff, and this reduced rates substantially. This is the beginning of the government making money from other places than tariffs. So forever, tariffs were a major source of revenue for the government. Beginning in this time, the government starts to get revenue elsewhere. And if they're not getting them from tariffs, they're going to get them from people in the form of income tax. And in 1913, which has been described as the worst year ever, that is when a national income tax happens, and that's the 16th Amendment. It is a populist idea, and there is a graduated income tax, meaning the more money you make, the more the government will take. That's Mr. Claff for you, MrClaff.com. I got that from him. Wilson wants to go after the bank, and in 1907 it showed that the money supply was inelastic, or it wasn't able to increase in a time of crisis. And a very famous person, Louis D. Brandeis, who later is appointed to the Supreme Court by Wilson and also notably was the first Jewish person to serve on the Supreme Court, he wrote a book called Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It. And this details all the problems with the banking system. So in 1913, the government passes something called the Federal Reserve Act. And the Federal Reserve is responsible for increasing and decreasing money supply based on need. This is still around today. They print their own money. If you look at any money you have, that is printed by the Federal Reserve. Here's a $10,000 bill, and on the $10,000 bill was Salmon P. Chase, who was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary during his first term. Guys, when you see the Federal Reserve, in essence, it's kind of like the third bus or the third bank of the United States. Members are appointed terms by the president, including the head of the Federal Reserve. Very, very powerful. Two major responsibilities of the Federal Reserve: one, to increase or decrease the supply of money; two, to print money. President Wilson starts to go after some trusts. In 1914, we have the Federal Trade Commission Act, which allows the president to appoint commissions to investigate monopolies. We have the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This is wicked, wicked, wicked important. If you think back to another antitrust act that we had, it was the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman Antitrust Act had a goal to break up monopolies. In actuality, it didn't break up monopolies, it broke up unions. That's a problem for unions. That's not the intention. That was not the intention of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the Clayton Antitrust Act comes along, gives more power to the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's made interlocking directories illegal. That was popularized by J.P. Morgan, and that's when the same individuals serve as directors on boards of competing firms. That is illegal. There's J.P. Morgan. He's very sad. He's got a cane. He's going to start beating people. And this made, the Clayton Antitrust Act made labor unions and agricultural organizations exempt from antitrust prosecution. So no longer could people break up labor unions or suppress labor unions like they could under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Please know those two acts. Know them well, guys. And again, unlike the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was used against labor unions. Okay, I'm going to throw a bunch of acts at you on this page. Please be familiar with virtually all of them. The Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 made credit available to farmers at low interest rates. This is kind of the opposite of the crop lien system, if you remember, during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, when farmers, particularly in the South, had to take out really high interest rates. The Federal Farm Loan Act, allowed farmers to take out loans at low interest rates. The Lafayette-Siemens Act of 1915 required a decent treatment and a living wage on American merchant ships. One of the unintended consequences of this is that the cost to ship goods. The question is why? Because businesses now had to pay sailors more, so the cost of goods increases to help pay for that. The Working Men's Compensation Act of 1916 essentially says if you are a federal employee and you are on disability, you go on disability, you will get some money from the government. The Adamson Act of 1916 was a huge boost for people that worked on trains, interstate trains. 8-hour workday would be the maximum. Anything more than that, you get overtime. So that's an opportunity for people to make more money. And then during this time period, Louis Brandeis was appointed Justice of the Supreme Court. And again, he was the first Jew to serve on the court, and he was a very, very progressive person. Louis Brandeis is a very progressive person on the Supreme Court, and he will favor many of these progressive laws. Woodrow Wilson was not a fan of the imperialistic policies that were followed and pursued by Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. He particularly disliked dollar diplomacy, so he backed off this imperialistic and aggressive foreign policy. He hated the big stick, and he hated the dollar diplomacy policies, particularly as how they related to Latin America. In 1916, we have the Jones Act, which promised independence to the Philippines as soon as a stable government could be established. A stable government doesn't happen for about 30 more years, but they do get their independence on July 4th, 1946. William Jennings Bryan, who is a perennial presidential loser, becomes Secretary of State, and he is similar to what other guy who lost 3 times? Henry Clay. I did it again. You think I can't find a way to tie him in, but I'll do it every chapter. He's just that important to me. Basically, Mexico goes through a revolution in the early 1900s. America is very concerned because nearly half of the property is owned by Americans and American businesses. The president of Mexico dies, and then General Huerta, who is an Indian, is installed as president after the revolution. Wilson despises this guy, and he believes that the countries have an obligation, quote unquote, an obligation to elect good men. So he's going to do everything in his power to get rid of him, including providing money and weapons to his enemies. This guy here, Pancho Villa, and the other guy, Carranza. Now, the U.S. thinks it's in good with Villa, and he's fighting and helping to overthrow the government. The problem is Pancho Villa eventually doesn't like the United States and starts turning on the United States. And he later gets assassinated in 1923. Basically, Wilson's policy in Mexico is a complete and utter disaster. It makes the U.S. look very, very bad. Now we're going to go over to Europe and what's happening in 1914. World War I started in Europe when Franz Ferdinand and his wife was assassinated. There are four main causes of World War I. If you've taken global history, especially New York State, you should know them as the four main causes. I teach my students the following. M stands for militarism. A stands for alliances, I stands for imperialism, N stands for nationalism. Put those four together with the assassination, and all heck breaks loose. And the U.S. tries to remain neutral for quite a while. Here's Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. All of a sudden, Gavril Princip comes along and shoots him, and he dies. Yeah, poor Franz. And his wife dies too, sadly. Now, the U.S. tries to remain neutral. Remember this whole idea of isolation, staying out of foreign affairs, and entangling alliances. It goes back to George Washington. However, U.S. naturally had more in common with Britain than Germany. We have the language, the culture, economic ties, trading partners, you name it. Naturally, the U.S. had more in common with Britain. Anti-German hysteria sweeps across the United States during World War I. We're going to see people drinking less because drinking is associated with German culture. However, 11 million people in the U.S., quite a large number, had ties to the Central Power countries, which include Austria, Hungary, and Germany as the two biggest ones. We have an issue. A briefcase was accidentally left in a New York City elevator, which showed Germany wanted to sabotage U.S. factories. So we have a German Shepherd here saying, uh-oh, my bad, because the briefcase was left behind. Terrible joke. I'm trying here. I'm sorry. Now, America has been accused of earning blood money. We'll see an investigation that happens in the 1930s as a result of this. Britain and France soon wanted to order many, many goods from the United States, particularly weapons. Great Britain would not allow the Germans to trade with the United States, so they actually blockaded out Germany, would not allow American ships to go to Germany. That is essentially is a violation of American rights, but America kind of dealt with it. So trade between the U.S. and Germany essentially ceased or stopped. Germany is going to be PO'd, so they're going to start a policy called unrestricted submarine warfare, where they would sink all merchant ships that are not German. Or Berlin said they would try not to sink neutral ships, but they didn't really do a good job of that. And on May 7th, 1915, we have the Lusitania, which is sunk, and 128 Americans are killed during this. The U.S. is furious. Germany backed off slightly. They kind of realized they did a big boo-boo there. They didn't want to get the U.S. involved. Later on, they sink many more ships, and then they issue something called the Sussex Pledge. And please know the Sussex Pledge, guys. And Germany promised that no attacks would be made on ships without warning. So in other words, they'll come to the surface and say, hey, we're going to sink your ship. You have 20 minutes or whatever to get off before this ship sinks. That doesn't last very long. 1916, Wilson is running again. Roosevelt, realizing that the 1912 election was a disaster for the Republicans, decides he's not going to run again. This is the death knell to the Progressive Party. Because the Progressive or Bulma's Party was formed around one person, once he decides he's not going to run, it's over. It is the death blow to it. Republicans nominate a Supreme Court Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, who was a very conservative guy, and Wilson campaigned on the slogan, he kept us out of war. So war in Europe, peace in America, God bless Wilson. That's it for Chapter 29. We have a lot more with World War I in Chapter 30. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have not already subscribed, please subscribe to my channel down below. I appreciate all the people who are sharing the word and telling people. I'm getting more and more people subscribing. I ask every time you watch one of these videos, if you enjoy these videos, if you find them helpful, please tell somebody to subscribe. Take a moment if you could and post it on Twitter, post it on your Facebook. Help me reach as many people as possible. I would greatly appreciate it. And again, you don't want to see JP Morgan angry, and he's very angry if you don't subscribe. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me. And that's it. Have a good day, guys.